I tricked Sam Bankman-Fried into a third interview with me, and this time he may have admitted to fraud. You'll be the judge. You can click to this timestamp if you just want to listen to the interview, but I want to explain the background, the strategy that went into this call to try to learn where others had failed, including, by the way, learning from my own failures interviewing Sam. Now, first, I want to give some background. Sam at no point has wanted to talk to me. Every time I've kind of snuck on these Q&As and started peppering him with questions, he usually leaves. But I realized that since this was my third time basically doing the exact same trick, it was probably going to be one of my last, because at some point he was going to catch on. So I knew going into this, it might be my last chance to interview Sam. And because of that, I had to think long and hard about what the perfect line of questioning would be to really pin Sam down, knowing that he's a master at dodging questions. He's done it with everybody so far, including me, by the way. And I mean, look, I think we've got some great stuff, but to this point, I didn't think anyone had gotten that smoking gun. He always denies everything. He always has a sort of a loophole out of it. So I'd have to try a different tactic. And here was my plan. Sam's whole excuse about not being a con man all hinges around Alameda Research. Basically, he says he knew nothing of what was going on there because he was just the CEO of FTX. And while that's nearly impossible to believe that he's this stupid or incompetent, it's really hard to prove 100%. So I realized if we were going to do this, I'd have to remove Alameda from my case, right? I needed to show that Sam had knowingly defrauded people without invoking Alameda at any point. And here was my plan to do it. I was going to spend the entire time laser focused on the FTX terms of service. Now, some of you may know FTX lays out that they cannot use customer funds for anything. They can't trade with them. They can't loan them out. And I thought this was a really important point because obviously that money is no longer there. So clearly something must have happened. But I'm far from the first person to notice this. Many people, including myself, have already tried to ask him about this and pin him down, but for various reasons, well, it didn't work. And I needed to learn why so we could avoid it. So I want to go through a few major interviews with Sam and show why this line of questioning has always fallen apart, starting with the New York Times.
The terms of service for FTX, and I just want to read you this. It says, none of the digital assets in your account are the property of or shall or may be loaned to FTX Trading. FTX Trading does not represent or treat digital assets in users' accounts as belonging to FTX Trading. So how is it possible that Alameda had this loan of such a large size?
So there's that piece of the terms of service, but there were a number of other parts of the terms of service and a number of other parts of the platform on top of that. There is the borrow lending facility, where users were lending billions of dollars of assets to each other, collateralized by assets on the exchange. You had obviously futures contracts where there were leveraged positions on. Now, of course, all of this, it's meant to be the case that these are positions where FTX could, if it needed to, margin call those positions and close them down in time such that it would cover all of those, all those shorts, all those liabilities. Obviously, that wasn't the case here, and that's a massive failure of oversight, of risk management, and of diffusion of responsibility from myself running FTX.
But just make this very straight. Was there commingling of funds? That's what it appears like. It appears like there's been a genuine commingling of the funds that are of FTX customers that were not supposed to be commingled with your separate firm.
I ain't knowingly commingle funds.
Okay, Sorkin tried and failed here to pin him down on the terms of service. Why? Well, because Sam escapes in this talk about a different part of the terms of service, which related to margin trading, where you take out some kind of a loan. And in a way, it was a complete deflection. Like, it doesn't matter that there's a separate margin trading terms of service because the people who weren't margin trading still should have had their funds kept safe. But it sort of threw Sorkin off track. And so now we're going to move to the Stephanopoulos interview, which was a bit better because Sam's going to try the margin trading story. But watch Stephanopoulos. He does a better job at honing in on the question.
But as you know, the FTX terms of service tell the people who signed up, none of the digital assets in your account are the property of or shall be or may be loaned to FTX Trading. But you're saying that happened.
My understanding is a few things happened. The first is there is a margin trading facility. on FTX, by which users can lend out funds, by which other users borrow funds. And so there are explicit cases where there is, margin extended, where there is borrow lending.
If Alameda is borrowing the money that belongs to FTX depositors, that's a bright red line, isn't it?
There are a lot of cases where that's actually explicitly part of the programs and that are happening.
Not here. Here it says that the digital assets may not be loaned to FTX trading. They can't be loaned out.
There existed a borrow lending facility on FTX. And I think that's probably covered, I don't remember exactly where, but somewhere else in the terms of service.
But they'd have to approve of that. They're saying they didn't approve of it here. They're saying you approved of it.
This is great stuff from Stephanopoulos. He refocused the question, but Sam's about to weasel out with a new trick. Go ahead and watch.
If you rewind to the beginning of FTX, where some customers were I think in line with sort of existing relationships that they've had, at least in some cases, wiring money straight to Alameda Research in order to trade on FTX.
So you do know, and you did know, that FTX deposits were being funneled to Alameda.
So I was vaguely aware that was how some wires were being sent in the first place.
Didn't that set off alarm bells in your head?
So there were a lot of people who were involved in that process, and look, I really deeply wish that I had taken a lot more responsibility for understanding what the details were of what was going on there.
This is how he slips out again. He tried the margin trading explanation, it didn't work, so he pivots to, okay, well, there's this weird backstory where FTX used to take wires from Alameda, and maybe that's where we lost the money, right? It's another smokescreen, but unfortunately, it kind of hamstrung the conversation. And if I was going to succeed, I'd have to beat that explanation. And in the first couple interviews I did with Sam, I tried to go with this insider angle, where insiders I had talked to had told me something very different, but it didn't work. Go ahead and watch.
There's sort of all this talk about the terms of service. Did you break terms of service? Did you not? You're basically claiming that there was this separate side of your terms of service. But I talked to somebody from Alameda and asked how big the position of, or how many people had assets in the type of accounts that terms of service would apply to versus the regular terms of service, which said you couldn't use their money. And they said it was about $1 billion that was in the margin trading, or the margin side of things, where you could reuse their funds or whatever, and there was the rest of it was not there. So it seems like you're putting all your eggs behind this one excuse about, there was this separate side of the terms of service. How do you address everyone else?
So I don't have all the data in front of me. My memory is that it was substantially more than $1 billion. I can't verify that. On top of that, there were other effects as well. Some of those were early wire transfers sent directly to Alameda.
Yeah, I kind of got stuck where Stephanopoulos roughly got stuck. I should have known that he was just going to refuse the evidence of insiders and just say, well, I disagree, and go back to his Alameda wire explanation. And I tried following it up a bit, but it didn't really matter. I had kind of missed my shot on that particular angle. And as I reflected on this, I realized all of the talk about margin trading, future trading, wire transfers to Alameda, all of it is a smokescreen from the big problem. The big problem is that some percentage of FTX's customer base never sent a wire to Alameda, they never signed up to margin trading, they never did spot margin. All they did was put their assets on the platform, and they were told that their assets would not be borrowed, it would not be loaned out, and that money would always be there. And it wasn't there. Why wasn't it there? There's no other way to explain that. If the money's not there, then fraud. And I had to laser in on that one point, not get distracted by these shiny objects that Sam's throwing up about this or that, or what about this, what about that? No, there's only one question that matters, and it's impossible for him to answer, I thought. So that was my strategy going into it. That was the backstory and how I learned from previous interviews. So without further ado, here's my third and probably final call with Sam Bankman-Fried.
I'm about to go out.
Okay, call Nero.
Hey Sam, it's me again. I just wanted to ask real quick about the terms of service question, which Rec brought up a little bit. I want to expound on it. Can you just tell us yes or no, were you treating client assets just on the regular digital asset side different from the margin trading side?
I do think we're treating them differently. There were a bunch of different sides, or more than two sides there. But I do think that we were cognizant of the fact that like there were differences between uses for like margin versus staking versus spot versus futures collateral versus other things.
Yeah, just people. I'm just talking about people just putting Bitcoin on the exchange. Obviously, there was really clear terms of service around that. If it's true that you didn't invest client assets, not even in treasuries, as you said via a now deleted tweet, why do those client assets no longer exist?
So I'm trying to trace through some of this. Here's my best guess, and I wish I could give you a more confident answer, but I don't have the data. But my best guess is basically it's a combination of the following. One piece is the transfer sent directly to Alameda Research from customers. One piece, and that I think is a fairly substantial piece. One piece is.
Wait, can you explain what that piece means? So people were sending money to Alameda instead of they were getting credited on FTX, and Alameda just ended up using those funds, and they were never held separately per the terms of service.
Well, there was a separate legal agreement with that. I don't know the details of it. I have it in front of me, but there's a separate legal agreement with respect to transfers that were sent directly to Alameda Research by users, especially before FTX had its own bank accounts. And so I do think that is part of what happened there, likely.
Let's focus on only client assets that happened after FTX got a bank. Y'all said digital assets are treated a very specific way. Why were those digital assets not treated that way?
So of the remaining piece, and there's a few other pieces as well around futures and other things. I understand that's not what you're talking about. For the ones that you are talking about, right? For the ones that were left, and I'm just taking a stab at this because I don't have the data, but my best guess is the following: is that there were a lot of those assets remaining. We processed something like $5 or $6 billion, I think, of withdrawals over the few days prior to, or I guess the few days during the crash, and there are still a few $1 billion of those remaining, I think, in the estate. And so you put those together, you have many billions of dollars of those assets. But I think, and so that's part of the answer, is that there were a large number of actual assets there. I think there's one follow-up question you probably still have there, which is, well, how about people who didn't withdraw and were also in that bucket? And part of the answer is, well, there still do exist some number of billions of dollars of assets, of hard assets in the estate.
No, is there one-to-one assets? Because that's the whole thing. We're talking about a separation of funds. So those funds should be in a different place, in a different wallet than everybody else. What you talked about, servicing billions of dollars of withdrawals, has nothing to do with those specific digital assets, because that's just first come, first serve, whoever pulled out first. We're talking about people who never agreed to have their funds loaned out, who never agreed to have their funds put on margin. They should have, according to your terms of service, one-to-one backing. It should all still be in some bucket somewhere. And are you confident today, as the CEO of FTX, this has nothing to do with Alameda, are you confident today to say that those are absolutely real and they exist and they're present, people are backed one-to-one on client digital assets?
So I think, and again, I'm just taking a stab here, but I think what happened is that if you look at especially a lot of the withdrawals that happened, those withdrawals were not necessarily only coming from people who never used margin trading or futures or staking or anything else. Those weren't just withdrawals from people who were keeping one-to-one back, or were sort of just keeping them as pure spot balances. And it was omnibus wallets, between the various categories. And so I think that the answer to your question is that a number of those assets were withdrawn by people who had balances on the exchange, potentially in the few days prior to the collapse. And if you wanted to think about it this way, it could be that that happened, and then when the collapse sort of completed, that effectively meant that there was, if you wanted to put it this way, like fungibility created during those withdrawals between assets for people who had and had not been used.
But that means that there is no separation of funds. If there's fungibility between two different buckets of category, there are no buckets. It's just one bucket. Everyone's taking out of the bucket, which means substantially anyone who had your terms of service with digital assets wasn't actually subject to that terms of service. They were subject to the same terms of service of your margin trading, right? Which is your more risky product. So you subjected everyone to the higher risk product because fundamentally, when it came down to it, you're saying there's fungibility. It's $1 here, $1 there. Everyone can take out $1 as fast as they want. Don't you see that as like defrauding your customers, the people who trusted you to just say, hey, this is not going to go anywhere except for we're not investing your assets? If I can exchange one-to-one and I'm the one who put risky stuff on with risky assets with risky terms of service, I can take the money that someone who didn't sign up to those same risky terms didn't agree to. Isn't that fraud?
So I'm specifically talking about what happened in the days immediately during and following the crash, in that 3 or say so day period. So I just want to respond to that. And I completely respect your question, but you have monopolized all of these discussions, CoffeeZilla. You need to let others speak, and you need to respond and stand as much here. I completely understand where you're coming from, but to answer your question, I didn't make a decision there. I just processed withdrawals as we normally do until it became clear we couldn't anymore, at which point we shut them off. And it was the case that, like, at that point, there was a big liquidity hole. That's what happened. If you want to judge that process and think that, like, we should have been spending those days frantically trying to code up a new withdrawal process, I disagree with you, but I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, sure. I think that's fine. I mean, it's not about coding up a new withdrawal process. It's about treating your client assets the way you told them they'd be treated, right? It's a very different thing completely. But anyways, I'll stop grandstanding for Sam. Thanks, guys. Oh my gosh. Woo! Oh my gosh. Wow. We got the call out. We got the shout out.
All right. You can probably tell I was pretty excited about that because I finally got what I was looking for. A straight answer on the problem of funds, right? Sam explicitly says that FTX was not separating funds. They were allowing generalized withdrawals. The dollars were fungible from different buckets. You can't do that. We finally dodged all the BS about margin trading, about Alameda wires. We finally got to the heart of it, which is that there are no funds left over for the people who just should have had their funds separated because they never separated them from the beginning. They were always seemingly commingled. And although Sam wouldn't necessarily agree that they were always commingled, the proof is in the pudding. FTX owes billions of dollars that they do not have. And it's because of how they allowed withdrawals. To give you kind of a regular finance analogy about why this is so cataclysmically bad, and in my opinion, fraud. Imagine you banked at JP Chase, right? And you have your money in the savings account part. Well, then you find out that they actually had this risky hedge fund. And you know what? They actually kind of blew up. In fact, they blew up so badly that JP Chase is all shutting down. But when you go to the bank to withdraw your money, you find out that instead of keeping your money safely in your savings account, they had allowed the people in the hedge fund business to just withdraw, first come, first serve, right? They treated all clients the same. according to them. Well, you say, well, no, that's fraud because you signed up to very different terms of service than the guy who knew he was going to be like, in this hedge fund, right? He had a different level of risk. He acknowledged that level of risk. And if you just throw all the money in one pot, the terms of service are meaningless, right? You're exposed to the same level of risk as the guy who took on huge risk. And that's fundamentally what happened at FTX. That's fraud. They told people their money was safe, and ultimately, they just subjected everyone to the same risk as like the day trading degenerate gambler on 100x leverage. And I really found the last thing Sam told me like so telling.
To answer your question, I made a decision there. I just processed withdrawals as we normally do. That's what happened. If you want to judge that process and think that like we should have been spending those days frantically trying to code up a new withdrawal process, I disagree with you, but I understand where you're coming from.
This is so interesting because no, of course I don't think you should be coding up a new withdrawal process while you're going bankrupt. But if throwing all your client funds in a pool and letting the first come first serve get the money, that's the wrong process to begin with. Your process was fraudulent from the start. It should have never been your process. Your process should have been what you promised clients, which is of course what I told Sam. And although I think Sam's probably guilty of a lot more than we covered here, I really wanted to get to this minimum viable fraud case, and I think we did get it. I mean, there is no sort of wiggling around the fact that he was the CEO of FTX, and all of this stuff that was bad that we proved happened at FTX. You don't have to invoke Alameda to get to this, so you can't say he didn't know, because he definitely did know, and he says he knew. So the last thing I'm going to close on, and I thought it was the funniest part, was his little outburst at the end about me monopolizing his time.
So I just want to respond to that. Please, I completely respect your question, but you have monopolized all of these discussions, CoffeeZilla. You need to let others speak, and you need to respond to what I'm saying and not grandstand as much here.
And I thought it was notable for two reasons. One, he hasn't lost his cool once in any interview. This is the first time I heard him really crack. And I thought that was interesting, but I also thought it was interesting because it's just not true. It's totally wrong. I've talked to Sam for, I think, 30 minutes across 3 interviews in total. For context, he gave the New York Times an hour. He gave George Stephanopoulos 2 hours. I think out of everyone he's talked to, or at least of the major interviews, I've talked to him the least. So if anything, I'm efficient with my time. That's all I'm going to say. And speaking of being efficient with my time, this video is over. Lock this man up, and I'll see you later. Thanks for watching.
And follow up. So I've talked to a few Alameda insiders, and I've kind of run them by your story of things. I think you probably are aware. I'm pretty skeptical. And one of them, when I told them, could it be that Sam wouldn't know about this? Somebody who worked with you, and they actually, they laughed, and they said, "There's no way he's claiming to be stupid now when he was this genius wonder kid." And so my sense of things is, how do you explain this? How do you explain the fact that some of the people who worked with you for years, their employees, have come out and said, there's no way he didn't know about these back doors. There's no way he didn't know what Caroline was doing when you guys were very close. The offices were right next to each other. I mean, how do you expect us to believe this story you're spinning?
I mean, I don't know what to say. I had a lot going on. And I was spread thin. I was a bit less grounded than I had been before. And I lost track of a lot of important things. And I think that...
Hang on one second. I think spread thin is one thing, right? I think, things can get out of hand. But we're talking about a fundamental understanding of whether Alameda was commingling funds with FTX. I mean, I saw your Stephanopoulos and Sorkin interview, and you're pretty categorical that you had no idea that you were mingling funds. So that's what I'm asking about, not did you know exactly what was happening on November 7th or 8th? I mean, I can understand sort of things getting out of control, but we're talking about the most fundamental grasp on how your business worked. You're telling us you had no idea.
I was not aware of what was going on. I was vaguely aware that some of these systems existed. I had no details of them, and I was not spending much time and on looking at, position risk management. It was a big mistake.
I mean, we're right, Sam. I've just got guys. I've just got a DM. Sam has to leave. So guys,
wait, can I, Mark?
So yeah, I have a couple questions. Read the margin accounts. I mean, there's sort of all this talk about the terms of service. Did you break terms of service? Did you not? You're basically claiming that there was this separate side of your terms of service, which said that if people had margin accounts, you could use kind of their funds, or there was looser language around that. But I talked to somebody from Alameda and asked how big the position of, or how many people had assets in the type of accounts that terms of service would apply to versus the regular terms of service, which said you couldn't use their money. And they said it was about $1 billion that was in the margin trading, or the margin side of things, where you could reuse their funds or whatever, and the rest of it was not there. So does that mean the rest of the money was stolen? I mean, it seems like you're putting all your eggs behind this one excuse about, there was this separate side of the terms of service. How do you address everyone else?
So I don't have all the data. My memory is that it's substantially more than $1 billion in the margin trading program. But I don't have that data in front of me right now, so I can't verify that. On top of that, there were other accounts as well, and I don't have to worry about all the details of those in front of me. But my understanding is that some of those were wire transfers sent directly to Alameda, which I think contributed to the position as well. And then there were positions on top of that, on top of the spot margin positions, where they socialized lots of clawbacks if one is unable to be closed in time. And so I think it was a combination of those factors. Another factor, but that's what I've been able to piece together. And that putting those together, I think is likely how you got to most of this.
But here's the thing: how do you account for maybe the difference in what people are hearing from insiders who are not being accused of fraud and you who sort of is? There's a very different sort of story going on here, where you're saying there's this big position that we didn't know about, because you told me that the last time we spoke in a space, and I went and followed up and I said, hey, is this true? Could it be that this number just wasn't known about? And some Alameda insiders said, no way. You could see on dashboards really simply where it was. And FTX dashboards, not Alameda dashboards that you yourself had access to. So my question is sort of it seems like when I go to Alameda insiders or FTX insiders, they're saying this story makes no sense. But when I go to you, who sort of has every incentive to sort of lie and obfuscate, because obviously the incentive here is, well, otherwise you might go to jail, which obviously would be a very bad thing for you. It seems like all of a sudden all the excuses come out, and then when we follow up on them, they don't seem to be true. So I don't know, help me square this, because, it'd be nice if you were telling the truth, but everything we're hearing from insiders is that you're not.
I don't know what to tell you. I'm saying what I believe. I don't know which insiders you're talking about. I don't know exactly what they said. It doesn't line up with my beliefs. But I can't speak to what they think or what they say.
But why are multiple people within your company at less senior roles knowing more about the company than you?
And Alameda was not the company that was running at the time, but I hear you. I'm sorry, I don't know exactly what you're referring to. I don't know who you're talking about. I don't know what they said.
Well, I'm telling you some of what they said. I mean, for example, one of them was that there was that backdoor system or whatever. A, that you knew it existed, and B, that it was easy to see the balance or the position of Alameda very simply on FTX dashboards, because they had a margin trading account with you guys, so you guys could have seen it. You guys could see the margin positions of everybody. No,
she did not appear in that main account.
So where was the position?
It was in a separate stub account, I believe, related to wire transfers that had been sent to Alameda Research, generally primarily to FTX. Having some bank.
So who controlled the secret stub account? Did anyone at Alameda know about this secret stub account? I mean, are we supposed to believe that just like there was this stub account that nobody knew about?
I don't know about what one. Sorry.
I mean, clearly somebody lost money, right? Like obviously the money went somewhere. Somebody lost it. It just seems really convenient that $8 billion was located in this like account that didn't show up when you pulled up Alameda's balances, right?
Yeah. I don't know what to tell you.
Okay, so a separate question is obviously around this Forbes thing, because you said you don't have present knowledge of sort of like Alameda's balances, and they came out and said that you were giving them up-to-date balances from Alameda. How do you square that? Just as of a month ago, you knew Alameda's position. How does that square with your statement about like you don't know what's going on?
I haven't seen the thing that you're referring to, but I would say it's very rough approximations that included a subset of the list of the assets that Alameda had. My assets that we had, like, the largest sets of them. I'm not doing full accounting. All of Alameda's position, because I didn't generally have those, and because it was a complicated process and depended on liquidity of tokens and things like that from the Ford's perspective. So I was just sending them a sort of abbreviated partial list of Alameda assets periodically.
But that means you knew that what Alameda had. Even roughly you knew what Alameda had.
I had a rough sense of what their assets are. That is correct. By rough, I do mean to within, $10 billion or so. I did not have a fine-grained sense of what their total asset value was, and I did not have a fine-grained sense of their liabilities or of their margin position size or how that was split up.
I guess one of my questions is like, what do you think should be done if we find out that you're lying about all of this? Like sort of, because it's kind of one thing to steal people's money. It's another thing to lie about it. What do you think should be done? Like, because I mean, it's going to be, obviously a lot of this is going to eventually get litigated. Eventually Caroline Ellison's going to have to take the stand. What happens if she pulls out text messages that shows you knew about it? I mean, do you think that wipes away your credibility?
I mean, I think a lot of my credibility has already been wiped away, frankly. And
I think that's
honestly, that's not what I'm thinking about right now. I'm not trying to focus on, I'm just thinking about like customers here who I think are what matter.
So you're saying there's a chance for them to get money back, or for us to get our money back?
I don't want to speak out of turn, and I can't make promises on behalf of the company. I can't speak on behalf of the company. And I don't know what decisions everyone's going to make. I do know that FTX US, to my knowledge, is totally solvent and could, I think, return everyone's money tomorrow if it wanted to. And I think internationally, there are a lot of pathways, potentially forward there that one could imagine FTX International taking. I think, I know that as of before I filed, there were billions of dollars of like serious funding offers potentially on the table, and I would expect and hope that those are being deeply.
Who were those funding offers?
I don't know that I have authority to say.
Well, you said you had $4 billion that came in, right?
Yep.
Does that still exist? Was that ever real?
I think it. I don't know for sure, but I think that some of those might. My guess is that some of them might. I hope that the sort of relevant teams are doing whatever they can to maximize value for customers here.
Yeah, it just kind of doesn't make a lot of sense why someone would pour $4 billion when you guys have liabilities sort of as high as you do. Can you talk a bit about the mark-to-market like statements you were making around solvency? You're making some pretty outrageous statements about like FTX, had the money when a lot of it was Serum, FTT, these tokens that you can't sell in those amounts, and that would completely crash the price. That can't support that kind of selling. Were you kind of deliberately misleading people there?
So, what I can say is I was just thinking about them in terms of, in terms of their market price was just whatever their market price was at the time. And, obviously I was cognizant of the fact that, you can't, the market price isn't necessarily, is never, what you could sell a large amount of something for, but I also massively misjudged that discrepancy there. And
what do you mean you massively misjudged it? Because you knew sort of roughly the percentage of Serum and FTT you held, and you knew the trading volume. I mean, you are a smart guy, you're a professional trader, there's no way you make a simple mistake like that, right? Like how's that even possible?
I mean, it was a pretty big misjudgment, a mistake that I made, and a pretty embarrassing one, but I was thinking of it internally in the context of standard market environment, and obviously that still means, substantial impact, but it's a different scale than what you would see, than what we did see in the market crash that happened, where without selling, without liquidating the position, there was a much larger than 50% market crash in a few-day period, with very little inside liquidity, and that obviously history has said that those events are possible, those very correlated market crashes, and not just very correlated market crashes in those instruments, but ones where hedges don't end up working fully, or even
but we don't even need to have this market crash for the statement about mark-to-market accounting making no sense, right? And you just said that yourself. Even with standard movements, right? If you tried to sell the amount of Serum or FTT that you had on the books, you wouldn't have gotten half, you wouldn't have gotten a quarter of what you put on your books to investors. And so the question is like, we know that you're not, the problem is like every time it comes to this hard point, the answer seems to always be, I made an embarrassing mistake. But at what point are you going to say like, no, I'm a smart guy, right? You were at the highest levels of this entire industry. You were the guy to go to, the smartest guy in the room, right? It's hard to believe that you made this many embarrassing mistakes. One embarrassing mistake, I get it. But everything's an embarrassing mistake. At least tell us that you knew that the mark-to-market made no sense.
And the way that I was thinking about risk as Core was starting with mark-to-market and then adjusting down effectively from that. And obviously that means that there should be a real buffer, because of exactly what you're saying. That buffer should have been a lot larger than I was thinking of.
But you never went down from risk from there, and you said publicly, FTX is solvent, other views may differ. Well, there is no other view on it. There's the fact of how markets work, and you were making public misleading statements. It wasn't one time you did this. You continued to make misleading statements about it after people had given you pushback. So,
sorry, which time are you talking about here?
I think it was in one of your follow-ups about the what happened. You said something about other views may differ.
Oh, that was FTX US, was it not?
I'm going to look it up real quick. I got a quick question about Dan Friedberg, your chief regulatory officer. This is a guy,
I don't feel comfortable difficult like talking about other people without getting sort of their sign off on that. So I think there's a limited extent to which I'm going to be willing or comfortable speaking on others' behalves.
No, that's totally fair, and I don't want you to speak on his behalf. Obviously, I want you to share your perspective, your unique perspective on the situation. Just like the same, I might ask a question about Caroline Ellison, but I only could expect your position on the situation. So, kind of the situation there is obviously this is sort of a tale of two stories about how FTX failed. One is like a lack of regulation, a lack of clarity, kind of just this thing that accumulated over time. The other one is, of course, a story of fraud. Of course, we have to look at who were the adults in the room. One of the adults, obviously, was Dan Friedberg, Chief Regulatory Officer. I'm sure you're aware he was behind the ultimate bet scandal where he gave players God mode in a poker game where people could see the hands, and he actually basically conspired with Russ Hamilton to hide that. So does that suggest something about your intention that you hired a guy that basically one of his biggest achievements was hiding fraud? Can you explain sort of your thinking? I know you don't want to talk about him. Can you explain your thinking about why this would be the guy you choose as the Chief Regulatory Officer?
We had a number of people in legal department. That was maybe our fastest growing department. We had a number of outside law firms as well. Dan was obviously one of the people who had been working for FTX for a while.
Yeah, he's the chief guy. He should have caught some of this stuff, you'd think, in theory.
Well, when you say he's the chief guy, we also have general counsels, we have other positions as well, but I can't speak to what other people's views were, what they thought or knew or were intending when, but I know that our legal and regulatory team had an enormous task in front of them. We were looking to get licensed and regulated in dozens of jurisdictions at once. We did end up doing that. That was an unbelievably large undertaking, which I think took up most of the time of most of our legal compliance departments, and in retrospect, I think probably took up too much time. But at the end of the day, I was CEO, and that means that at the end of the day, it's on me to make sure that we have people who are in charge of all of the important things. And I did that for some of the areas. I failed to do that for others.
But why'd you choose him specifically? I mean, obviously, you could have chosen a lot of different lawyers to go with. And I understand you had multiple lawyers, but if this story of FTX is largely a failure of regulation, a failure of controls at an organization, and your chief regulatory officer is Dan Friedberg, the question is, well, maybe this wouldn't have happened if you hadn't put a guy like this in front of this. I'm not obviously saying it's his fault solely, but I'm just asking sort of what was the thinking behind putting this guy in charge? Because it seems like you couldn't pick a less qualified candidate if you want to get actual regulation in the room.
I didn't say this was a failure of regulation, and we did an enormous amount of work on getting licensed and regulated. We're licensed in more jurisdictions than I think any other exchange was. I think it was an absolute failure of oversight of risk management. And I think that in retrospect, I would have viewed the core dues and things I needed to make sure more so than anything else very differently than I did. But from a licensed perspective, we did do quite a bit there, and were able to accomplish that in a fairly short period of time. And so I think I'm not sure that I completely agree with the premise of that framing of the question. And I'll just say that the people who work with FTX, I have enormous respect for most of them, and they did enormously valuable work, and they didn't do all the work. Obviously, there are really important things that didn't get done, but that's on me to make sure that there are people who are doing all of the important things, because there's way too much to do. We're doing way too much as a company for any particular person to be expected to be definitely on top of even of some important things, given how many other important things they also had to be doing at the time. And by the way, I do apologize to you. I am barely when I say I do have to hop off.
Sam, thank you so much for your time, and CoffeeZilla and other speakers. Thank you so much, Marty. Everybody, thank you so much.
My lawyers chewed me the out for that one. The first thing they said after that was, they said, Sam,